Hi there, Natasha here, creator and host of this special series by Crime Squad podcast. I need to warn you, this episode in particular is going to cover very difficult subject matter, including violence, abuse of power, racism, and death. Listener discretion is strongly advised. December 1992. Canadian peacekeepers are deployed to Somalia, a war-torn country on the brink of collapse. Among them, the Canadian Airborne Regiment, elite, disciplined, and battle-ready. But this wasn't supposed to be a battle. What followed would become one of the darkest chapters in Canadian military history. A brutal killing, a widespread cover-up, and a national reckoning that reached the highest levels of power. This was not a battlefield casualty. This was a 16-year-old boy, tortured and beaten to death while in Canadian custody. And it forced an entire nation to ask, who are we when no one is watching? This is Command and Controversy Episode 2, The Somalia Affair, a National Disgrace. In our last episode, we traced the birth of the Airborne Regiment, elite, proud, and built for rapid deployment. In this episode, we're heading into much darker territory. The Somalia Affair didn't just mark the end of a regiment. It forced Canadians to confront uncomfortable truths about our military, our institutions, and our values. Somalia is one of the least developed countries in the world. This was true in the 1990s and still true in today's world. Geographically, Somalia spreads out along the Indian Ocean at the most eastern corner of Africa. It borders Ethiopia, Kenya, Djibouti, and the Gulf of Aden. The country itself is about the size of the Canadian province of Saskatchewan, and in 1992, the population was hovering around 8 million. Somalia is mostly always hot and very dry. Temperatures hover between 30 and 40 degrees Celsius, and there are frequent droughts. There is a monsoon season, however, the rainfall is often unpredictable and irregular. Life in Somalia can be tough, and the people are resilient and work hard to survive. Most of Somalia's residents are well below the poverty line and struggle to make ends meet. In 1969, General Mohammed Siad Barre rose to power in Somalia through a coup d'etat, a military takeover that notably occurred without bloodshed. The coup was carried out by the Somali National Army, which Barre commanded. It followed the assassination of Somalia's sitting president, Abdurrashid Ali Shamark, plunging the nation into political uncertainty. Capitalizing on the chaos, Barre ordered his troops to seize control of Mogadishu, the capital. Government buildings were occupied, and within hours, the army had effectively taken control of the state. Once the takeover was complete, the acting president and prime minister were forced to resign, clearing the path for Barre to declare himself as the head of state. Under the rule of Siad Barre, Somalia became an authoritarian state and would remain that way for the next 21 years. At first, there was hope. Barre launched ambitious campaigns to modernize and nationalize the country. Banks were built, industries were developed, infrastructure expanded. But as the years passed, that vision crumbled. By the 1980s, public support began to evaporate. Barre responded not with reform, but with brutality. He ruled through fear, silencing opposition and targeting communities he saw as a threat. Between 1987 and 1989, Barr orchestrated a genocide of Isaac's civilians. It's estimated that over 100,000 people were killed. Entire cities, including Hargeisa and Berar, were reduced to rubble. More than 500,000 Somalis were displaced, with many fleeing to Ethiopia for safety. Historians believe that Barr's violence may have been shaped by a traumatic childhood, in which he reportedly witnessed the deaths of his father and brother killed by members of a rival clan. Whether this shaped his psyche or not, one thing is clear. He ruled as a dictator, one who left deep scars across an entire nation. The Barr regime was responsible for extrajudicial killings, torture, rape, and mass intimidation. Citizens were unlawfully detained and imprisoned in horrific conditions. Somalia was bleeding, and the people had had enough. By 1991, rebel forces were closing in. Sensing the end, Siad Barre fled Mogadishu in a tank, looting $27 million in gold and foreign currency from the Somali Central Bank as he went. He retreated to Somalia's southwest, tried and failed to launch a military comeback, and within 5 months, he was overthrown for good. He fled into exile in Nigeria, where he died in 1995. With Barre gone, the government collapsed. There were no institutions, no leaders, no law. Somalia had become a failed state, one of the first to define that term. A country unable to control its borders, unable to feed its people, and unable to provide the most basic human rights. In April 1992, the United Nations launched UNOSOM-1, the United Nations operation in Somalia. It was a desperate attempt to bring humanitarian aid and stability to a country teetering on the edge of collapse. By then, over 10 million Somalis were at risk of starvation. Barre's fall left a vacuum of power that warlords rushed to fill. Somalia's people, resilient yet devastated, would now face civil war, famine, and the long, slow struggle to rebuild their future from the ashes of a dictatorship. They landed in Somalia in December of 1992. Their boots hit the dry, cracked earth near the city of Beledweyne, a far cry from the snow-covered forests of Petawawa. For many, it was a complete culture shock. From -30 to sweltering heat, from ice and silence to dust, noise, and the unknown. The mission was clear: protect civilians from armed gangs, escort food convoys, help rebuild schools, roads, and bridges. A peacekeeping mission. But not everyone believed the Canadian Airborne Regiment was the right choice. One of them was Brigadier General Ernest Beno, commander of the Special Service Force in Petawawa. He had concerns, serious ones. He argued that the airborne were elite combat troops trained for rapid assaults and high-intensity conflict, not for peacekeeping. He raised the issue through official channels, but the decision had already been made from above. And that was the end of that. Politics played a role. The Airborne Regiment had been created for fast, no-notice deployment. They had missed multiple United Nations missions and hadn't deployed since Cyprus in 1974. For the regiment, Somalia was a chance to prove their worth, to get back into the field, to show Canada and the world what they could do. And they were hungry for it. According to Commodore David Cogden, a Defense Department planner at the time, there was also pressure from Ottawa. The Canadian government wanted troops on the ground as quickly as possible, ideally arriving at the same time as the Americans. But there was a problem. Unlike the US, Canada couldn't usually mobilize that fast. The Airborne Regiment, however, well, they could be on the move with almost no warning. And so they were sent. What happened next would test the limits of that decision and challenge everything Canadians believed about their peacekeepers. The Canadian Airborne Regiment arrived ready to work, but Somalia was unlike any mission they had trained for. The heat was oppressive. The dust got into everything: equipment, clothes, even their lungs. Local villages lay scattered, and the scars of conflict were visible everywhere. The mission was clear. They knew what they had to do: protect civilians and keep the peace. But the reality on the ground was much more complex. Armed gangs roamed the countryside, unstable alliances shifted daily, and the line between combat and peacekeeping blurred. Some soldiers began to feel the strain. The elite training that made them formidable fighters did not always prepare them for the subtle and sometimes brutal politics of peacekeeping. At night, around the campfires, soldiers talked about what they were seeing. Some questioned their orders. Others wondered if they could truly protect the people they'd come to help. Canadians serving in Somalia quickly realized that despite their mission being rooted in peacekeeping, providing food, healthcare, and aid, the local population was far from welcoming. The presence of foreign military forces stirred resentment and mistrust. What truly shocked many was the harsh and heartbreaking reality of life in Somalia. Soldiers witnessed unimaginable suffering, including desperate parents ending the lives of their own dying children to spare them from further pain. Despite ongoing efforts to distribute nourishment, severe hunger and malnutrition were widespread, a tragic legacy of Siad Barre's brutal 21-year dictatorship that had left the country fractured and starving. Amid this desperation, tensions grew inside the military compounds. Commanding officers grew frustrated with local Somalis who frequently tried to sneak into the compounds, attempting to steal essential supplies such as food, water, and other resources that was desperately needed to survive. The orders were grim and clear. Anyone caught stealing was to be harshly punished. The message was meant to be a deterrent, using individuals as examples to prevent others from trying. Whether these actions were officially commanded, merely suggested, or driven by sadistic cruelty, some soldiers took it a step further. They set traps, placing food and water near the outer fences, then waiting in the darkness to catch anyone who took the bait. Paratrooper Claude Lelancette was stationed at a watchtower on the 1 Commando compound on the night of March 4th, 1993. He was provided information that a Canadian soldier was posted just outside the razor wire fence of the compound, and this soldier was tasked with capturing anyone attempting to break in. Using his night vision device, a noddler, Lelancette spotted 2 Somali men entering the compound. He kept his gaze fixed on the intruders and called in the alert. Suddenly, the men changed direction, trying to flee through the fence. One man dropped to the ground. His name was Ahmed Arouche. The other dove through the razor wire with the sounds of gunfire cracking in the silence of the night, and he successfully escaped. Ahmed lay unarmed and injured. From his watchtower, Lelancette observed the scene through his noddler. 2 armed soldiers walked over to Ahmed's body. They raised their weapons and shot him point blank in the head. The body was transported to a hospital where Major Barry Armstrong, an armed forces surgeon, performed the autopsy. Major Armstrong concluded that Ahmed Arouche had been killed at close range, suffering shotgun wounds to his back. This wasn't right. Things weren't lining up. He was told the death was justified as a defensive move. His findings, though, led him to believe this was not a justified killing, but rather the murder of an unarmed civilian. The military ruled otherwise, justifying the shooting despite Major Armstrong's protests. He spoke of the blatant racism he witnessed within the Airborne Regiment and warned of corruption and cover-ups among his superiors. He believed the cover-up was to protect the Defense Minister Kim Campbell, who had intentions of running for Prime Minister of Canada leading the Conservative Party. There were to be no black marks under Defense Minister Campbell's oversight. Jennifer leaked the story to a journalist, and it quickly became headline news. Fearing for his safety, Major Armstrong was swiftly pulled from Somalia and flown back to Canada. He faced severe backlash, and many of his military colleagues never forgave him for speaking out. This was just the beginning of the dark truths coming to light in Somalia. Shidane Arone was born in 1976 in southwestern Somalia, a harsh desert zone locals called the Burnt Country. This land, marked by severe heat and relentless drought, is some of the most unforgiving on Earth. But for the nomads who call it home, survival is a way of life. They are resilient, shaped by the desert heat and their deep faith in Amarka Elahe, Allah's will. Shidane was a hard worker from an early age. His first job was tending the family's goats. By 10, he was managing the camel herd with his older brothers. Considered the king of cattle and livestock, the boys would sing songs to their camels as they walked the desert, a tradition honoring these very valuable animals. At 13, Shidane began living in his own hut, built from sticks, animal skins, and scraps of cardboard. He cared for his own goats and camels. His older brother had died from malaria, and in line with tradition, Shidane inherited his brother's wife, a 26-year-old who took care of the hut and prepared their meals. By 1992, Somalia was in turmoil. Siad Barre had been overthrown, and civil war had erupted, worsened by a brutal drought. Hundreds of thousands had died. Many more were malnourished. At 16, Shidane was small, 5'4" and just 120 pounds, worn down by the harsh desert life and hunger. On March 16th, Shidane began his day with a 5-kilometer walk to visit his uncle in Beledweyne. They talked for a while before Shidane left to buy grain and cooking oil from a small shop. He walked back to his hut where his wife awaited with a meal. And just after 8 p.m., Shidane left again, this time heading toward the Canadian military compound near Beledweyne. Why he entered the compound remains unclear. Perhaps desperation or the chance at taking food. A sudden flashlight beam cut through the pitch-black night, startling Shidane. He ran, dove into a portable toilet, and slammed the door shut, hoping to hide. What Shidane didn't know was the soldiers had a full team ready, including men using night vision devices who were watching every section. 2 armed soldiers dragged Shidane out of his hiding place, threw him to the ground, and searched him. They found no weapons. They found nothing stolen. They decided to bind him, and he was bound with a zap strap, with a riot baton wedged between his elbows. He was taken inside, where Master Corporal Clayton Matchie was waiting. What happened next is deeply painful to recount. Shidane Arone was subjected to cruel and inhumane treatment by members of the Canadian Airborne Regiment. The following segment contains descriptions of torture and violence. Listener discretion is strongly advised. Shidane Arone's story is a painful reminder of the responsibility to uphold human rights, even in the most challenging circumstances. I am sharing Shidane's story not to shock or sensationalize, but because the soldier's actions went far beyond any order or military discipline. Shidane's suffering was a brutal violation of human dignity. What you need to know, first and foremost, is that Shidane was made to suffer, and he suffered greatly. This 16-year-old boy, small, unarmed, living in a country torn apart by civil unrest, might have been considered a man in Somalia, but to me, he was just a boy. A boy who entered a Canadian military compound and paid the price for it. Shidane was subjected to horrific treatment, much of it inflicted by Master Corporal Clayton Matchie. He was forced into contorted, agonizing positions. He was waterboarded. He was kicked repeatedly, including blows to the head, delivered karate style with steel-toed army boots. He was burned with lit cigarettes across various parts of his body. Witnesses say Matchie laughed through much of the torture, even boasting, "The white man feared the Indian, so too will the black man." Amidst the violence, Shidane cried out one word again and again: "Canada, Canada, Canada." By this time, after ongoing blunt force trauma with a baton against his head, his face was badly broken, with a fractured cheekbone piercing through his skin. Private Kyle Brown, who was present for much of this abuse, was becoming upset with the violence. It was going on for far too long. Brown asked Matchie if he was done, and Matchie replied back that he wasn't. He said he wanted to kill Shidane. Despite being upset at the torture inflicted upon Shidane, Kyle Brown loaded a roll of color film into his camera. 16 photographs were taken, documenting the horrific scene. Multiple photographs showed Matchie posing with Shidane's battered body. In one, holding his head like a trophy. In another, pressing a pistol to Shidane's temple. Again and again, the camera clicked, and images were etched into the film. Shidane laying slumped in the sand, with only his arm restraints holding him up. Shidane in blood and urine-soaked clothing, his head hanging, appearing incoherent. The flash of the camera going off again and again caused a few soldiers to come and check out what was happening. One of the soldiers had a metal bar that the troops had been using to kill scorpions. Matchie demanded the soldier give him the metal bar, which he then used to slam Shidane's shins with. This jolted Shidane into consciousness, and he screamed out again that same word: "Canada, Canada, Canada." This was not a secret beating. At least 16 soldiers witnessed the torture. Upwards of 80 could hear Shidane's screams, some from over 70 feet away. After 3 brutal hours of senseless torture, Machi finished his assault. He used his baton to deliver 4 blows to Shidane's face. At some point, Private Brown had left to report what was going on to Sergeant Hillier. Hillier arrived too late. Shidane Arone was already dead. Hillier sprung into action quickly. He notified Major Anthony Seward that something had happened on base. He called for a truck to transport Shidane's body to a nearby hospital. Major Seward attended the hospital with Shidane's body. An airborne medical officer gave a simple explanation. Head trauma, no autopsy, no questions. Major Seward, aware of the gravity of the situation, pushed gently. He asked if it was possible the injuries to Shidane could have been sustained during an arrest. The medical officer nodded. This small exchange marked the first step in an attempt to cover up what had happened in the walls of the Canadian military compound. A 16-year-old boy, unarmed, starving, and terrified, had died in the custody of Canadian soldiers. Not in the chaos of a firefight, not in the fog of war. No, Shidane had been killed in cold blood. The next day, March 17th, 1993, a heavy silence blanketed the compound. Everyone knew what had happened the night before. Clayton Machi picked up a satellite phone and called his wife. In a flat, almost casual tone, he told her, "Some shit went down. Someone died on us." Major Anthony Seward was now in damage control mode and quietly trying to understand how to contain what had happened. He approached Sergeant Hillier for a temperature check, testing the waters. Seward proposed an explanation. The Army doctor had suggested that perhaps Shidane's injuries had occurred during the arrest. Sergeant Hillier didn't say a word, but he didn't need to. He shook his head, and in that single gesture made it clear he would not be part of a lie. On March 18th, Private Kyle Brown was called in for questioning. He described what had happened in his words and was asked to hand over the film from his camera to Major Seward. It was hard to argue against the pictures. After all, pictures speak 1,000 words. Later that same day, Clayton Machi was placed under arrest and confined to a prison bunker. The next morning, March 19th, Machi tried to end his life. He pulled a drawstring from his combat jacket, fashioned a noose, and attempted to hang himself. A guard found him and cut him down, but the damage was done. Machi fell into a coma and was evacuated. First to Mogadishu, then eventually to Ottawa. He survived, but not intact. He suffered permanent brain damage. Medical evaluations later determined he now had the cognitive capacity of a small child. What followed was not swift justice. It was slow denial, confusion, deliberate redirection, and silence. The kind of silence that stretches from the ground up, from the dirt in the compound where Shidane cried out, all the way to the polished floors of the Department of National Defense in Parliament Hill. The killing of Shidane Arone wasn't just the act of a few rogue soldiers. It revealed something far more dangerous, a military culture that allowed this to happen and nearly got away with it. It raised urgent questions. Who gave the orders? Who stayed silent? Only a select few within the chain of command were informed about the killing. It wasn't until March 26th, 9 days after Shidane's death, that the Department of National Defense was officially notified the case was being treated as a homicide. The Canadian public would not learn the truth until March 31st, when the story broke in the media. By then, it was too big to hide, and that was only just the beginning. Next time on Command and Controversy, we step into the aftermath, into the courtroom, into Parliament, into the back rooms of power where reputations were protected and some were sacrificed. We'll look at how a mission intended to provide aid and peace unraveled into a scandal, how a regiment was disbanded, how whistleblowers were silenced, and how the culture of accountability in Canada's armed forces was tested and, many believe, failed. Coming soon, Episode 3, Fallout, Disbandment, Denial, and Damage Control. Join me as we begin to unpack the cost of silence and the damage done in the name of protecting an image.